Chase Hughes has been covering the Wizards for several years now. Works for Monumental Sports. He's out in Chicago for the NBA Draft Combine, where he's seen a lot of testing of some of these elite players: Peterson, Dybantsa, Boozer, etc. Caleb Wilson. By the way, Dybantsa registered the highest vertical leap at just over 42 inches. Chase is with us right now. So, great news. They got number one overall. The bad news is there's choice, and there's not an obvious number one. Most people feel that way. Maybe you feel differently. You and I have talked about Dybantsa and Peterson going back to the early portion of the basketball season. But let me ask you, as we sit, today, and we ponder what might happen on June 23rd, the night of, or even beforehand, just give me sort of the percent chance that they take Dybantsa, Peterson, somebody else, or trade.
Well, I'll give you that in a second. First of all, I think it's actually good news there's no consensus number one pick. I've long had a theory that there can be a lot of groupthink with a consensus number one. And if you look back at drafts of the past, the vast majority of the time, that guy doesn't end up being the number one pick. So I think sometimes you're sort of backed into a corner. You take the guy, you're crazy not to, but if you know the history of the draft, you know that guy's probably not going to be the best pick. So I think they have a little bit of more room for creative thinking, and I think that could work to their advantage. But right now, in terms of percentage, I'm not trying to cop out of this. I think it's 50-50 between Dybantsa and Peterson. I was more certain yesterday that Dybantsa, looking at mock drafts, maybe it was 60-40, but I keep hearing that they like both of these guys. And I think, they wanted the power of choice. They know that this is a really good draft. And I think it's as simple as you're splitting hairs between two, possibly three guys that are worthy of a number one pick in the average year. And so they really feel like they need to take their time, do their due diligence. My guess is that a consensus won't form until a couple weeks before the draft, kind of like it did with Anthony Edwards 6 years ago.
If they remain, 50-50 on those two players, and Utah isn't 50-50, they're 100-0 on Dybantsa, do you think they would consider a trade back?
Oh, 100% they would consider it. I think that falls into just the due diligence. You'd be crazy not to pick up the phone. It kind of reminds me, as you know, I used to cover the Nationals, and I remember Mike Rizzo, people would ask him, would you listen to trade offers for like Bryce Harper or whatever? And he would always say, I'm never not going to pick up the phone. I'll always listen. And the first time I heard it, I was kind of surprised, but he would say it every year. And then it just kind of started to, click for me. Of course, you got to pick up the phone. You never know what a team's going to offer. Look at the Lakers and how they got Luka. So
have you contemplated what that trade would look like? I'm just curious.
I've taken a look at the Jazz roster, of course. The Wizards, whenever they make trades the last few years, they've favored future draft capital. The Jazz have a ton of that, right? They triggered a rebuild by trading Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, so they got a bunch of draft picks. But what's an interesting wild card in all of this is so much was made about the proposed draft lottery rules that could be voted in later this month. And I think what's done a little underrated is the potential ramifications and domino effects in terms of the trade value. Like first-round picks are going to have a different set of value if those rules go through. Veteran players who can help teams compete for the play-in, maybe teams otherwise would have stripped their roster down. Like a lot of stuff's going to change. So I think it's a little difficult at this moment to predict trade value and try to predict trades.
All right, back to them staying at one and picking. So what is the buzz out there? You've said you think they're probably 50-50, Dybantsa, Peterson. What's the buzz overall about Dybantsa, Peterson, Boozer, Caleb Wilson, etc.? Is there a chance? I mean, like you said, things will change between now and the 23rd, but what are you sort of sensing is the lean for most people out there?
I would say the lean for most people is Dybantsa, but, ultimately it's the Wizards' call. And, they, I think, have a pretty strong track record in the draft, especially when you look at like Will Riley and Keyshawn George, some of these cases where they've been able to see something other teams didn't. So it ultimately does come down to them. But I would say the buzz coming out of yesterday, you mentioned it, the Dybantsa vertical leap is unbelievable. 42 inches at basically 6'9" without shoes. Like, I think if you were to rank the best athletes to come into the draft this century, Dybantsa wouldn't be too far behind LeBron and Wemby. Like, how many guys have those types of measurables and explosiveness?
What about Banchero?
Like, you're probably.
What about Edwards?
I think this is well beyond Banchero. Edwards, sure, but Edwards wasn't 6'9" without shoes. Like, I think you're probably talking Dwight Howard. I think Derrick Rose would be one of the most explosive athletes, obviously. But Dybantsa's in that category. So that was crazy. I think Boozer beating all these guys in some of the quickness drills was surprising. Wilson, measured out really well, of course. He's taller than I expected. Peterson's taller than I expected. People were comparing him, former players were comparing him to Bradley Beal, but then he measured in at 6'4.5" without shoes. So he's going to be about 6'6" on the court. Like that's a different type of player than Bradley Beal, who was about 6'3". So it just, I think, further convinced everyone that this is a special class because all these guys had pretty strong selling points coming out of measurement day.
I'm reading something that you just tweeted, I guess, yesterday, and I totally agree with it. Dybantsa's three-point shooting percentage wasn't great, but the stroke is solid, and you saw some of that right yesterday at the Combine.
Yeah. I was tweeting some additional context because I had a video people were attaching to the misses that he made, even though he made more than he missed in the video. But yeah, I'm a believer in his shooting ability. He was extremely efficient overall. And I don't have it in front of me. I think he shot like 33% from three. It's not like it was like 20%. And then I remember looking at his game logs, and there was a chunk of 17 games in the middle of the season. He played 35 games. So this is half of the year, where he shot about 39% from three on 5 attempts a game. So he started slow. I thought he looked a little tired at the end of the season in the tournament, even though he scored a bunch of points against Texas. So you never know what fatigue can do to shooting numbers. It's still ultimately a small sample size, but for half of his season to shoot about 39% from three on 5 attempts, that was convincing to me. And as you mentioned, just the shooting touch all over the floor. Like, he hits shots from all over. It's just, he wasn't shooting 40% from three, but there's no reason to believe that he can't develop a 3-point shot.
At Chase DC Sports on X. So what are you hearing in terms of the kind of due diligence, the depth of the due diligence on Darryn Peterson that will be required between now and the 23rd?
Well, it goes way back to when these guys are like 14 years old, if you ask Will Dawkins. So they've done a lot of their due diligence, but sitting down and interviewing these guys at the Combine, bringing them in for a visit, we'll see what a workout looks like. It always depends with the top players. Usually it's an individual thing. They don't want to go against each other. But this is an important runway because the Wizards now know they have an opportunity to get these guys. And the way Will Dawkins likes to say is that they draft people, not players. So they got to make sure that the intangibles are what they're looking for. And I think it's probably more important this year than maybe your average year, because as we've said, you're splitting hairs between two really, really good prospects, potentially three. And I think fit into culture and intangibles and play style might be more important this year than it is in the years past. I don't think position is really going to matter. I think they're going to take the best player no matter what position they are, but certainly they want someone who, has the same priorities that they do. And I don't think that's going to be easy to decipher, because my read on all three of these top guys, if you're including Boozer, Wilson as well, is that they're all very serious about basketball, especially for their age, and they love the game and they work hard. And I don't see major red flags with any of them.
So how would you, there was a lot of celebrating and a lot of, justifiable excitement that the Wizards finally got some lottery luck and ended up with number one overall. But there was a lot of, at least with my listeners, this feeling like it was the culmination of something. And I'm like, no, this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of now trying to take all of these accumulated assets, players, picks, et cetera, and that part won't stop, and they need to start winning. How would you describe where we are in the midst of this rebuild that started 3 years ago?
I think they were ready to elevate already, and this just gives them some rocket fuel to shoot forward. You're right. It's, the famous Kobe Bryant quote, "Job's not finished." I think Michael Winger and Will Dawkins would tell you that no, this isn't what they started the rebuild for. Obviously, you wanted high draft picks, but they started the rebuild so that when they come out on the other end, they're winning 50 plus games and they have a window for deep playoff runs, multiple years on top of multiple years. So this could very much help them get there. It's going to potentially fast track some things, but they still know that, they got bigger goals in mind. But certainly it's a huge, huge boost. I mean, I think the difference between picking first this year and fifth, which was their worst case scenario, probably less so than the average year, because I think even at 5, you're going to get a potential future star, but the timeline is pretty important. I think the guys that you're picking at number 1 overall are going to make an instant impact and also present the long-term upside, when if you were picking 5th, you'd bring in a guy who probably, you'd have to set the expectations pretty low in year 1, maybe even year 2. So this certainly gets the Wizards in a really good spot moving forward.
Yeah, you just sort of described, because I think in trying to define what the end needs to be to sort of justify the entire process, I think what you just described is what I believe to be true as well. Like, saying a championship is unrealistic because it's so hard to win one in the NBA. But 50 plus, 45 to 50 plus win seasons consistently over a several year period with, top 3, top 4 Eastern Conference finishes with, the opportunity in a year or 2 or 3 of those to go deep, and potentially, be in an Eastern Conference Finals or actually a championship series. That, to me, sort of is the definition of an end that would justify this entire previous 3 years. Is that where you would go with it, or would you go further?
No, I think that's correct. I mean, obviously their goal is to win a championship, but I think you often find, talking to executives, that the best thing you can do is just try to raise the floor of a team to a degree where you're in the playoffs year after year, and then you just hope that at least one of those years you break through and win it all, and it's your year. You're healthy, the stars align. But you mentioned conference finals and 50 wins. We all know they haven't done that since the 70s. So I think that's a fair goal to have in mind, and I think that's why they really wanted to take the long view, and they continue to take the long view. They got the first overall pick, but Winger and Dawkins have said this many times. They said in their opening press conference, they draft guys understanding that it's going to take like 8 to 10 years for them to reach their peak. And they're going to have to learn how to play in the NBA and then learn how to win. And that's usually a multi-year process. So I don't expect whoever they select first overall to change everything overnight. On the court, off the court, might be a different story, because I think we've already seen there's a pretty massive jolt of energy that has been given to this franchise.
Is Anthony Davis going to play for this team next year?
My expectation is yes. I mean, Will Dawkins has said that on the record multiple times. Anthony Davis, obviously, he's kind of towed a line in his own comments, but he's also said a lot of nice things about the organization and the talent that they have. And that was before they got the number 1 pick. And then, I think he's reacted, it seems. It's kind of cryptic what he's posted on social media, but it seems like he likes the news that they got the number 1 pick. So, we'll have to see. But obviously, the game's been changed a little bit in terms of their roster and their outlook with this news. So if they end up having a conversation with Anthony Davis, he's mentioned he wants to have that. I don't know if it's happened yet, but certainly if the Wizards have another feather in their cap now.
Let's assume that he is on the roster. He's healthy. He plays a lot of the season, 60 plus games. Give me your top 7, your 5 starters, including whomever they pick at number 1, first couple of guys off the bench, and what their best case in 2026, 2027 is in terms of number of wins.
Right now, my guess is that if it's Peterson or Dybantsa at 1, they are in the starting lineup. Boozer or Wilson, those guys play the 4. If you're telling me Anthony Davis is playing 60-plus games, they're probably backing him and Alex Sarr up, right, realistically?
Right.
So your starting lineup's probably Trae Young, either Keyshawn George or Darryn Peterson at the 2, and then either Keyshawn George or Dybantsa at the 3, depending on who's the pick. And then Davis and Sarr is your 4 and 5. I think coming off the bench, I definitely think Will Riley profiles well as like a microwave scorer. We saw what he did down the stretch.
Yep.
Bub Carrington, with the way he shot last year, maybe running the second unit. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think Bilal Coulibaly still has a role, regardless of who they select, even if there's overlap with, the position because of his defense and because this team wasn't great defensively last year and can't really afford to, just set aside a guy who can defend on the wing as well as he can. And then after that, obviously they're going to have a backup big man, ideally, who can rebound. Perhaps that's Tristan Vukcevic. Perhaps that's an area they target in free agency. And I don't want to leave out Justin Champagnie. He is under contract. I really like the way he plays, the way he rebounds. His team was dreadful at rebounding last year, has been for several years. And he's a good isolation defender, too. So I think he would find his way into the rotation. But, that's a pretty young roster. So I think we'll have to see what they do in the draft. Free agencies after that, I think they'll kind of take a breath after the draft and say, well, what areas do we need to augment from here? And certainly veteran help could be of use if you're trying to make the playoffs. So that's where I think it would stand right now. I hope I didn't leave anyone out. I mean,
Trey Johnson.
Trey Johnson, I left him out. Okay, so Trey Johnson, yeah. Speaking of microwave scorers off the bench, if he's not starting, it's a 2. But I like the idea of him coming off the bench and just lighting it up from 3.
And, would they still be playing a year from now in the second round?
Oh, in the second round, I think that's probably pretty lofty. I think that would be a really unexpectedly exciting season. I think the plan sounds good. I mean, I think what's a little bit underrated is how the bottom of the Eastern Conference got a lot better this year.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at the standings in the moment, but I believe the Hornets won 43 games and were the 9 seed, right? And didn't even make the playoffs. That's a pretty high bar if you won 17 games last year. And going back to the lottery rules, if they go through, it might be a more competitive league. It might be a more competitive Eastern Conference. So I think, if you're in the 30s, that's great. And I think that could probably get you in the play-in tournament. But if it doesn't and the lottery rules go through, you might be in a pretty good spot come next year for the lottery.
As always, thanks for doing this. Really appreciate your thoughts and insight. Enjoy the rest of Chicago, and I'll talk to you probably before the draft.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin.
Chase Hughes, everybody at Chase DC Sports.